Hello again, this is Mr. Sexton, and we're getting ready to have our daily video for day 4 of the winter 2019 intersession, and it's going to be for December 19th, 2018. We're going to be talking about Chapter 3, which deals with federalism. Before I get into the discussion of the chapter, make sure you watch this video all the way to its conclusion today, because at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about an assignment that is due entitled How Many Senators Do I Have? And it would definitely be to your advantage to go ahead and make sure you listen to that portion of the video concerning that assignment. Alrighty, today's chapter deals with federalism. And the first thing I want to drive home about federalism is that as we look at the Constitution last chapter, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but a lot of the things that were addressed in the Constitution weren't brand new ideas. Bicameralism wasn't a brand new idea. The Three-Fifths Compromise even wasn't a brand new idea. The fact that we had a written Constitution wasn't a brand new idea. Limited government wasn't a brand new idea. So lots of things that we find in the Constitution weren't brand new ideas. But one thing that was brand new with the United States Constitution is the concept of federalism. Federal systems of government did not exist in the world until we wrote our Constitution in 1787 and ratified it in 1789. So we're going to be looking at a brand new concept for the world in this chapter. And what you need to take away from this chapter are several things. The first thing that you need to talk about, understand, is the difference between a federal form of government, which we create with the Constitution, and the form of government that we find around the world most commonly prior to that, known as a unitary system. So make sure you understand the difference between a federal form of government and a unitary system. Make sure you're aware of what the major difference between the two is, and that difference being who has power. Okay? Now, after you get done discussing and understanding the difference between a unitary and a federal form of government, then we're going to get right into the heart of the matter in how the Constitution addresses the issue of federalism. And the several important things that you need to take away from this chapter deal with what powers do the national government have, what powers does the state government have, and what powers do the two of them share. So as you're reading through the chapter, make sure you pick up on the national powers, and while reading that section, make sure you understand what expressed powers are. Understand what implied powers are. Make sure you understand how implied powers relate to the necessary and proper clause. Not directly addressed in this section of the chapter, but a little bit later in the chapter, is the concept of the Commerce Clause, which goes directly to the idea of national powers. After we look at national powers, then you're going to have to take a look at state powers. We call state powers reserved powers, and understand where they're addressed, primarily in the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Okay? And then the last type of power you need to understand and be familiar with some of the examples are what we call concurrent powers. Powers that are shared by both the national and state government. Make sure you have some examples of expressed powers, have some examples of implied powers, have some examples of reserved powers and concurrent powers. Okay? Then after we talk about, the chapter talks about national power and state powers, then we're going to take a look at the relationship between the states. Because when we look at national versus state power, we're talking about the relationship between the national government and the state government. We also need to understand that federalism deals with the relationship between states. So when we look at the relationship between states, we look primarily at three things. We're going to look at the Commerce Clause. You're going to have to be familiar with what's called the full faith and credit clause, and then you're also going to have to be familiar with the privileges and immunities clause. Those three concepts deal primarily with how should one state in the United States treat another state. Okay. Now, the largest part of this chapter, as far as number of pages, deals with what I call the different eras or periods of federalism. Federalism isn't the same today as it was in 1789. So as you're reading that section of the chapter, make sure you understand the difference between dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Make sure you understand the impact that the period of time in our country's history known as the New Deal. Understand how the New Deal impacts federalism. And then your textbook also talks about what we call regulated federalism. So if we were going to, set out the three time periods, we got to look at dual versus cooperative federalism. Then we talk about the New Deal federalism, and then we look at regulated federalism. Then if we look at federalism today, probably the most significant thing in the textbook that deals with federalism today is how the national and state governments interact with each other as far as finances go. Most of the money that's paid in taxes in this country goes to the national government. The national government then turns around and gives some of that money to the states. Make sure you're familiar with the process that we call the Federal Grants in Aid program. When you look at the Grants in Aid program, make sure you understand things like the different types of federal grants: categorical grants, block grants, formula grants. Okay? Then make sure you understand the concept of unfunded mandates. Understand how the federal government used to start getting states to do what they wanted by giving them money. Nowadays, the federal government has so much power because they control so much money that they can get the states to do things without giving them money, called unfunded mandates. Understand how those operate. And then the last major concept within the chapter that I want to make sure you have a good understanding of is the concept of devolution. When we first started out under federalism, there was almost pure balance between national power and state power. Nowadays, since the national government has more money, the national government has more power. There's a lot of people in the country who think we need to go back to the way it used to be. Give the states and the national government more equalized power, and going back to the way it used to be is called devolution. Be familiar with that concept and how the grants that we give today at the national level can impact devolution. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, there is an assignment that's due today that I want to talk a little bit about. In the chapter itself, it talks about the nuts and bolts of federalism. What federalism is and what kind of powers the national government and state governments have and the types of grants that the national government gives. One thing it doesn't talk about that I think is very important is that federalism also creates this system where you have a group of people that you elect that represent you at the national level. And then you also have another completely separate group of people that you elect that represents you at your state level. The assignment that's listed on the Moodle site that's due today is called How Many Senators Do I Have? And the assignment is designed to do several things. It's designed to kind of explain to you the difference between your elected officials in your national legislature, which we call Congress, and the elected officials who represent you in your state legislature, and here in Missouri we call that the General Assembly. So you need to understand that there's a difference between the two. The problem that we run into as Americans is that people that represent us in Congress generally represent us in the United States House of Representatives or the United States Senate. In states, we have people who represent us in the state Senate and the state House of Representatives. So if I ask you who your senator is, it can be confusing because you have U.S. senators and you have state senators. You need to be gathering information when completing this assignment about the difference between these senators and representatives at the national level and the senators and representatives at the state level. You also need to understand how these individuals represent you. There are two U.S. senators from Missouri, and both of them represent you. There are 34 members of the Missouri State Senate, but only one of them represents you. Same thing in the United States House of Representatives. There are 8 members of the United States House of Representatives, only one of them represents you. There are 163 members of the Missouri State House of Representatives. Only one of them represents you. So in this assignment, you need to be gathering some information that's in the text of the assignment. I give you maps. They're not for the state of Missouri, they're for the state of Indiana, but the same concepts apply to Indiana that apply to Missouri. You need to be looking at those maps and not only being able to answer the questions that are asked as part of the assignment, you need to understand these concepts of what's the difference between a state senator and a U.S. senator. Also, how many people represent me in my state legislature as opposed to how many people represent me in the national legislature. And when I say represents you, you as an individual, depending on where you live in the state, has a certain number of people who represent you and that part of the state. So please, if you have any questions while completing this assignment or after the assignment's done, make sure you get back to me with this, because this assignment is just the first of 3 assignments that are going to be designed to help you figure out exactly who represents you at the national level in Congress and who represents you at the state level in your state legislature. Good luck, and make sure you give me a call if you have any questions about anything that's going on either today or for the semester.